We begin, as we always do, with the truth of a woman the world had already decided to forget. At 34 years old, Eliza Hale stood on the frozen boardwalk of Coldwater Bend, Wyoming Territory, with nothing left to her name but a carpet bag, a wool shawl gone thin at the elbows, and $6 folded into a handkerchief. Her husband's own cousin, Thomas Hale, had turned her out of the smithy that had been her home for 12 years, declaring before the whole town that a widow with no living son had no rightful claim to a blacksmith shop, whatever love or labor she had poured into it. And so, with winter closing its fist around the high plains, Eliza took what little money she had and did something the town would soon call foolish beyond reason. She paid $2 for a rusted, forgotten forge sitting abandoned in a collapsing barn outside the neighboring settlement of Prosper Gulch, a heap of iron so eaten by rust that the auctioneer had nearly refused to sell it at all. No one there knew, not even Eliza herself in that first cold hour, that sealed within the ash box of that ruined forge lay a secret that had waited 26 years to be found, one that would not only save her, but would quietly, justly, restore an entire town to what it once was. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Hale. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worthless, only to hold on to it anyway, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Eliza had not been born to hardship. She had been born Eliza Marsh, the daughter of Ohio wheelwright, in a household where labor was treated not as punishment, but as a kind of prayer, something you offered with your hands so that your family might eat, might stay warm, might hold its head up among neighbors. Her father, Nathaniel Marsh, had been a quiet, exacting man who believed that a woman's hands were as capable as any man's of understanding would grain, iron temper, and the patient arithmetic of a well-made wheel. He had let her stand at his elbow from the time she was 7 years old, watching him steam bend ash boards into perfect arcs, watching him listen, actually listen with his whole body to the sound a piece of metal made when it was close to failing. Metal talks, he used to tell her, tapping a rim with his knuckle, same as people. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. It was a lesson she never forgot, and one that would matter more than she could have imagined in the years ahead. When she was 19, a traveling blacksmith named Daniel Hale came through her father's shop needing an axle repaired, and stayed 3 days longer than the repair required. Daniel was broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, with the particular gentleness that some large men carry, as though they have made a private decision never to let their strength frighten anyone. He was, he told her honestly, the son of a man who had once owned a fine smithy far to the west, in a town called Coldwater Bend, before a fire and a run of terrible debts had taken it from him. Daniel's father, Josiah Hale, had died not long after, and the family name and the family trade had scattered like embers. Daniel himself had spent years working other men's forges, saving quietly, hoping one day to return west and rebuild what his father had lost. Eliza recognized in him the same reverence for work that her own father had given her, and when Daniel asked her to marry him and go west with him, she did not hesitate, though she wept leaving her father's shop, and though he pressed in her hands a small iron ring he had forged himself, telling her that a Marsh woman ought never arrive anywhere empty-handed. They arrived in Coldwater Bend in the spring, and though Daniel could not recover his father's original smithy, it had long since passed into other hands and eventually into ruin. He built a new one at the edge of town with the last of their savings and the sweat of his own back. Eliza worked beside him every day of their marriage, not as an ornament in the doorway, but as a true partner at the anvil, learning to shoe horses, repair plow blades, mend wagon tongues, and, most quietly, most precisely, to listen to metal the way her father had taught her. The townspeople of Coldwater Bend grew to trust the Hale smithy above any other for 40 miles, not because Daniel was the strongest hand in the territory, though he was strong, but because the work that came out of that shop never failed a man in the field or a woman on a lonely road. Eliza bore no children who lived past infancy, a grief she carried privately and without complaint, and in its place she poured herself entirely into the shop, into the town, into the slow, steady dignity of honest labor. She believed, as her father had taught her, that value was not loud. It did not announce itself. It waited to be recognized by those patient enough to look. Then, in the autumn of 1886, Daniel was thrown from a green colt he was shoeing, struck his head against the corner of the very anvil he had set with his own hands, and was gone within 3 days. Eliza buried him on a hillside overlooking the shop he had built, and told herself, in the numb weeks that followed, that grief was survivable, that work was survivable, that she still had the forge, the tools, the trade her father and her husband had both given her. She did not yet know that Daniel's cousin Thomas Hale, who had drifted into Coldwater Bend 2 years earlier and worked half-heartedly at the shop's edges, had already begun quietly telling the town's leading men that a widow could not properly run a smithy, that the business belonged by blood and by custom to the nearest living Hale male, and that it was, in his words, no fit work for a woman alone. The town's marshal and the circuit judge, both men who valued custom over conscience, found in Thomas's favor within a season, citing an old debt Daniel had never fully settled, and which Thomas claimed the right to absorb along with the property. Eliza was given 3 days to gather what was hers and go. What was hers, it turned out, was very little. Thomas claimed the tools as fixtures of a shop. He claimed the anvil, the bellows, even the modest house behind it, arguing it had been built on smithy land and belonged with the business. Eliza was permitted her clothes, a few pieces of her mother's linen, her father's iron ring which Thomas did not recognize as valuable enough to bother contesting, and after a bitter argument in front of half the town, the small strongbox of coins she and Daniel had saved together, which came, once counted, to $6.40. She left Coldwater Bend on foot that October morning with the carpet bag over her shoulder and the wind cutting through her thin coat, walking the 11 miles to Prosper Gulch because she had heard there might be work there for a woman who could keep a ledger or take in mending, though her heart, if she was honest with herself, still belonged to iron and fire and the particular music of a hammer finding its mark. It was in Prosper Gulch, 3 days later, cold and running low on the little money she had, that Eliza heard the auctioneer's bell ringing outside a collapsing barn on the town's western edge. An old prospector-turned-farrier named Ezra Whitlock had died that summer with no heirs anyone could locate, and the county was clearing his effects for whatever they might fetch, mostly to cover the cost of his burial. Eliza wandered toward the sound, less out of purpose than out of habit, drawn the way a woman raised among tools is always drawn to the sight of a shop being dismantled. What she found in that barn, half collapsed and open to the sky on one side, was a blacksmith's forge so old and so rusted that the auctioneer had to shout twice over the wind to get anyone to even glance at it. The firebox was choked with decades of ash and swallow nests. The bellows had rotted through. The iron itself, in places, had gone the deep orange-brown of true neglect, flaking at the edges like old bread. Every man in that small crowd of bidders, and there were perhaps a dozen, mostly there for Whitlock's decent set of harness leather and a serviceable wagon, looked at the forge and either laughed or looked away. But Eliza did not look away. She walked closer, the way her father had taught her to walk toward any piece of iron whose worth was in question, and she rested her palm flat against the cold, pitted surface of the firebox, and she felt something she could not have explained to a single person standing in that barn. A kind of rightness, a sense that the shape of the thing beneath her hand was not merely functional, but had been made, really made with care, by someone who understood the difference between a forge that merely worked and a forge that lasted. The joints were dovetailed in a manner she recognized, a manner her own father-in-law was said to have favored, though she told herself that was surely coincidence, that half the West had learned smithing from the same handful of traveling masters. When the auctioneer, more out of pity than expectation, asked if anyone would offer even a single dollar for this useless heap of rust nobody in their right mind would haul home, Eliza heard her own voice before she had fully decided to speak, offering $2, and heard the laughter ripple through the small crowd, and heard a woman behind her mutter to her husband that the Hale widow's gone soft in the head, buying scrap with her burying money. Eliza did not turn around. She paid her $2, arranged with a kind young teamster to haul the forge the 11 miles back toward Coldwater Bend for another 50 cents she could scarcely spare, and told herself, as the wagon creaked away from the ruined barn, that whatever foolishness had moved her hand, she would live with the consequences of it, the way she had learned to live with every other consequence life had handed her. She had learned to live with every other consequence life had handed her. It took her 4 days of scrubbing, scraping, and careful, patient labor before the forge was clean enough to properly examine, set up as it was in a lean-to she'd been permitted to use behind the boarding house, where she now paid for her room by doing the washing. She worked at it each evening after her chores were done, her hands raw, her back aching, driven by something she could not name beyond her father's old insistence that you never truly knew a piece of metal's worth until you had cleared away everything that was hiding it. It was on the 4th evening, working by lantern light with a wire brush at the base of the firebox, that her fingers found a seam in the iron floor of the ash box that did not belong, a hairline gap too straight, too deliberate, to be the work of rust or accident. Her heart began to beat strangely as she worked a thin blade into the seam, and after several minutes of careful prying, a false iron plate lifted away from the bottom of the ash box, revealing a shallow cavity beneath it, lined with a scrap of oiled canvas gone stiff and dark with age. Inside that cavity, untouched by 26 years of dust and neglect, lay a leather pouch, heavy in a way that made her breath catch, and folded beneath it, a letter, its wax seal cracked but unbroken, addressed in a strong, familiar hand to whoever restores this forge in honesty. Eliza sat back on her heels in the lantern light for a long moment before she dared to touch either the pouch or the letter, some old instinct telling her that what she had found was not merely valuable, but sacred in some private way she did not yet understand. When at last she opened the pouch, she found it filled with gold coin, more money than she had seen in her entire marriage, carefully wrapped in cloth to keep the coins from clinking and giving themselves away to any careless hand. And when she broke the seal on the letter and unfolded the brittle paper, she found, written in ink gone brown with age, the words, "To whoever has the patience to find this, you have proven yourself worthy of what I could not save in my own lifetime. I am Josiah Hale, and this forge was once the heart of the town I loved and failed. Use what you find here not for yourself alone, but for Coldwater Bend, as I meant to before the fire took my chance for me." Eliza read the name twice, 3 times, her hands trembling now not from cold, but from the sudden, dizzying recognition that the forge he had bought for $2 as a joke of fate was not a stranger's ruin at all. It was her own husband's father's forge, the very smithy Josiah Hale had built and lost decades before Daniel had ever come west to try to rebuild it in another man's shadow. The days that followed were, for Eliza, days of careful and often sleepless unraveling. She had known, in the vaguest way a young wife knows her husband's family history, that Daniel's father had once owned a fine smithy in Coldwater Bend before losing it to fire and debt, and that the family name had scattered afterward like sparks off an anvil. What she had never known, what it seemed almost no one now living in Coldwater Bend knew, was the fuller and stranger story that emerged as she read Josiah's letter again and again by lantern light, and later, when she dared to ask discreet questions of the oldest residents of Prosper Gulch, a story that had settled into the ground like sediment while the town above it went on with its business, unaware of what it was standing on. Its business unaware of what it was standing on. Josiah Hale, it turned out, had not simply lost his smithy to bad luck. In the years before the fire that ended his ownership, Coldwater Bend had been a town caught in a desperate financial squeeze, its fledgling bank teetering after a string of failed mining claims to the north had drained half the territory's speculative money. Josiah, whose smithy had prospered modestly through honest work, had quietly loaned a substantial sum of his own savings to the town's founding council, men whose names Eliza recognized from the plaques on Coldwater Bend's oldest buildings, to help keep the bank solvent and the town's fledgling businesses afloat through that terrible winter. The loan had been informal, sealed with handshakes and a private ledger rather than any binding legal document, because Josiah had trusted the men he'd grown up beside, men who had promised to repay him with interest once the mining troubles eased. But before that repayment could be made, fire had swept through the Smithy district one dry August night, started by an overturned lamp in a neighboring stable, and had taken Josiah's shop along with 3 others. In the chaos and grief that followed, with Josiah himself badly burned, trying to save his tools, the town's council had quietly let the matter of the loan slip away, some out of genuine confusion in the disorder. And Eliza came to suspect from certain hints in the letter, some out of the plainer and uglier temptation to simply let a ruined man's claim be forgotten. Josiah, broken in health and in spirit, had died within 2 years, never having recovered what was owed him, and never having told his son Daniel the full truth of what had happened, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of a father's instinct to spare his child a bitterness that could curdle a whole life. But Josiah had not gone to his grave without one last act of quiet, stubborn hope. In the months before his death, working alone in the borrowed shop of an old friend, the very forge Eliza now understood that had eventually passed through several hands and finally to Ezra Whitlock, Josiah had hidden away what remained of his savings, along with a portion of gold he had managed to recover from the town's belated and grudging partial settlement, sealing it beneath the ash box with his own hands, along with the ledger recording the original loan and the letter Eliza now held. He had done this, the letter explained, not to enrich himself in secret, but because he no longer trusted the town's leading men to use the money justly if he simply handed it over again, and because he hoped that whoever eventually found it, a stranger, a fellow smith, someone who had earned a right to the forge through honest labor rather than easy inheritance, would have the character to use it not for private gain, but to finish what he himself had not lived to finish, the restoration of Coldwater Bend's Smithy district, its modest bank, and the dignity of the working families who had been quietly ruined alongside him. Eliza sat with that knowledge for 3 long nights, turning it over the way she might turn a suspect weld under lamplight, testing it for weakness. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she now possessed both a fortune and a truth that could unmake Thomas Hale's claim to the smithy entirely, since Thomas's right to the property rested on an old unsettled debt that Josiah's hidden ledger proved the town itself, not the Hale family, truly owed. She understood, too, that she could simply take the gold, disappear west toward Oregon or California, and build a quiet, comfortable life far from a town that had cast her out without a second thought. No one in Coldwater Bend would ever know what she had found in a rusted forge nobody else had wanted. It would have been, by any ordinary measure, entirely justified. But Eliza Hale had been raised by a man who believed metal talked if you were quiet enough to listen, and she had spent 12 years married to another man who believed the same, and something in Josiah's careful, hopeful handwriting, a stranger's grandfather-in-law, reaching across a quarter century to trust her specifically, a woman he had never met, with the completion of his life's unfinished mercy, settled the matter for her in a way that felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of who she had always been. She would go back to Coldwater Bend, not to beg, and not to hide what she had found, but to see it used the way Josiah had intended. Her return to Coldwater Bend that November was met, as she had expected, with no small measure of scorn. Word had already traveled, as word does in small territorial towns, that the Hale widow had spent her last coins on a worthless heap of rusted iron, and there were those, Thomas Hale foremost among them, who took a certain satisfaction in her apparent ruin, believing it proved every unkind thing they had said about a woman's fitness to manage a trade. When Eliza requested a hearing before the same circuit judge who had ruled against her the previous autumn, presenting Josiah's ledger, his letter, and the recovered gold as evidence of a debt the town itself had never honestly settled, Thomas Hale led the opposition with a fury that surprised even those who knew him, insisting the documents were forgeries, that a woman clever enough to fabricate such a story was clever enough to fabricate the ink and paper to support it, and that in any case, whatever debt might once have existed had surely died with Josiah Hale a generation ago. Several of the town's older families, whose own grandfathers had sat on that original founding council, grew visibly uneasy at the proceedings, some because they feared what old wrongs might come to light, others because they had, in their own private ways, always suspected something unspoken lay beneath the town's tidy prosperity. It was old Reverend Absalom Pratt, the one man in Coldwater Bend old enough to remember the fire and the winter that followed it with his own eyes, who finally rose in that crowded meeting hall and confirmed, in a voice trembling with age and something close to relief at finally being asked, that he recalled his own father speaking in hushed tones of a debt owed to Josiah Hale that had been let go quiet on account of the fire, and never rightly settled. God forgive us. His testimony, together with the plain evidence of the ledger and the letter in Josiah's unmistakable hand, a hand several older residents recognized at once from old Smithy receipts still tucked in family papers, turned the tide of the room. The judge, unwilling to preside over an outright cover-up now that it stood so plainly exposed before witnesses, ruled that the original debt was valid, that Thomas Hale's claim to the smithy had rested improperly on land and property that ought rightfully to have passed through Josiah's line rather than been seized outright, and that Eliza, as Daniel Hale's widow and Josiah's legitimate heir by marriage, held a rightful claim to both the smithy and a formal accounting of what remained owed to the Hale family estate. Thomas, faced with public exposure of both his cruelty and his family's long-buried complicity, left Coldwater Bend within a month, taking what little he had gathered and never returning. His name from then on spoken in the town mostly as a quiet cautionary example rather than the respected figure he had once pretended to be. But Eliza did not use her restored claim, or the gold Josiah had hidden, to simply reclaim comfort for herself. She had spent 3 long nights deciding this, and she did not waver now. She took the bulk of Josiah's gold and, together with the town council that had been so thoroughly humbled by the revelation of its own old debt, established a modest cooperative fund for Coldwater Bend's working families. A fund to help widows and struggling tradesmen keep their shops through hard winters, administered not by any single wealthy hand, but by a small rotating board that included, at Eliza's insistence, at least one woman at all times, so that no family would ever again be turned out by the private judgment of men who had never had to prove their worth the way she had. She rebuilt the Hale smithy on its original ground, restoring Josiah's forge, the very rusted heap the whole town had once laughed at. As the working heart of the shop once more, its old iron cleaned, its joints repaired, its fire lit again after 26 cold years of silence. She kept, framed above the mantel of the small house behind the shop, both her father's iron ring and Josiah's letter, side by side, as a reminder to herself and to anyone who asked that the things people discard as worthless are very often waiting only for someone patient enough to listen to them properly. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman of 34, standing on a frozen boardwalk with $6 to her name, buying a rusted forge that an entire town had judged not worth the trouble of hauling away. It would have been easy, looking at Eliza Hale in that cold October moment, to see only what had been taken from her, the shop, the trust, the dignity a community owes to those who serve it faithfully. It would have been easy, too, to mistake the fortune she later uncovered as simple luck, a fairy tale coin buried beneath ash for a deserving woman to stumble upon. But that was never truly the shape of it. What Eliza found inside that forge was not luck. It was the long-delayed fruit of 2 men's patient, honest labor, her father-in-law's, and in its own way, her own father's, who had taught her decades earlier and hundreds of miles away that value is quiet, that it waits, that it reveals itself only to those willing to kneel down in the cold and really look. Eliza did not restore Coldwater Bend because a stranger's gold obligated her to. She restored it because restoring things, forges, families, towns, the quiet trust between neighbors, was, in the end, the only work she had ever truly known how to do, and the only inheritance, gold aside, that either of her fathers had ever meant to leave her. Thank you, truly, for spending this quiet hour with Eliza Hale and the forge no one else wanted. If her story moves something in you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding tonight that what looks like ruin is sometimes only waiting to be seen clearly. Before you go, we'd love to know, What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Tell us below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.